as I say, when we talk about Xanadu and when we talk about the Silk Road, it's all tremendously excited. It's the grand adventure. It's terribly romantic. And we are talking about something that it had taken the imagination of the people for hundreds of years. But the Silk Road, in reality, it was not a road at all. It was many, many different roads. And when I decided to call it From Venice to Xanadu, we must understand that actually the Silk Road started much earlier than Venice existed. So the Silk Road, in reality, was the first highway, the first superhighway linking Japan and China and Japan, of course, to Europe, across Central Asia, from ancient times by caravans and bazaars. We're going to go into that. But you must think that it was a huge movement of people, ideas, and goods. This is just an old map that more or less gives you an idea or a basic understanding of where the Silk Road was crossing. The famous Silk Road is neither an actual road nor a single route, but actually a network of routes used by traders for more than 1,500 years, from when the Han Dynasty opened trade in the year 130 BC until 1453 CE. That was when the Ottoman Empire closed off trade with the West. The Silk Road extended for approximately 7,000 kilometers, depending which roads you were taking, but across some of the most formidable landscape, including the Gobi Desert and the Pamir Mountains, linking exotic cities and trading in luxury and legendary goods. And that's actually what we're going to look at now. All started because of that. The Han Emperor, battling, trying as usual, having his war, having his conquest, he found that the Chinese horses of the time were not adequate. They were the small ponies that later on the Mongols were to use, and they were terribly adequate for the Mongols. But anyway, he had heard about those amazing horses that were coming from the Fergana Valley. The Fergana Valley is a place in Central Asia. Those horses were so special that they were called the heavenly horses. So the emperor sent an embassy to the Fergana Valley to trade for those horses. So obviously gold was not good enough to trade for the horses. Something more special was needed. And China had one thing that absolutely no one had at the time, and that was silk. That was this precious material that people didn't even understand its nature. There were all stories of silk-grown trees and all kind of mythology and legend about this fabled material. So the first trade started the heavenly horses for silk. And that actually is why we still call it today the Silk Road. But at the time, there were two very important empires. We're talking about the year 0 and until 100, more or less, when the Roman Empire had become more stable. And at the same time, the same thing has been happening in the Han Empire, what we call China. So these two empires heard about each other. That's why I call it the eagle and the dragon. They heard about each other, and both were terribly curious about those other lands. And they start sending embassies and trying to get stories about it. None of those embassies actually ever arrived to each side, but there were incredible stories told in Europe about China and vice versa. Of course, the more important of those fables was silk. People, as I say, didn't understand where silk came from. It was true, silk came from trees, but it didn't grow on trees. What it did grow on the trees were the wombs. And it was very interesting because this is something that I got from an old book. It says, silk both trouble and delighted the Romans. A century after the Battle of Carrhae, the Battle of Carrhae was the first time when they saw silk. The truth is the enemies of Rome were carrying silk banners. And when the Romans saw those red and gold silk flashing in the sun, they saw there was some kind of precious metal that it was flashing in the top of the standards. Later they found out, of course, that it was a material, really, that it was silk. Anyway, so as I want to get me out of the picture because I want you to see that. It says, as the silk both troubled and delighted the Romans, a century after the Battle of Carrhae, silk was immensely popular across the Roman Empire. This weakness for a foreign luxury was bitterly criticized by Rome's stern moralists. In the first century, Pliny the Elder wrote, at least 100 million sesterces flowed to China out of our empire every year. This is how much luxury and women cost us. As usual, men complaining about women spending too much money on clothing. The story was only women were allowed to wear silk. And the only man who was allowed to wear silk was the emperor. But because silk was so expensive, many times it was unwoven and rewoven out again in a much lighter way so they could create more meters. That means the silk was very transparent by the time that was sold in Rome. So obviously it was totally scandalous. But silk, nevertheless, it was only for the very rich or for the aristocracy. But now let's talk about the Silk Road and the goods that went through it. Of course, because the merchants will travel, let's say somebody will travel from Constantinople to Persia, then the silk will be sold there, and from Persia it will be taken over into Samarkand and resold again. Nobody really traveled the whole of the Silk Road. People were traveling a small part of the Silk Road, and things will be sold and resold and resold. So every time things were sold again, the markup will become higher. Every time there were also overheads, enormous, very expensive overheads, which means the things that were sold on the Silk Road were terribly, terribly expensive. Therefore, it could only be luxuries. We had amazing ivory coming into Constantinople from Africa by Egypt. We had precious stones from Sri Lanka and India. We had jade from China and Burma, spices from different parts of the Middle East, the fabled carpets from Iran and Iraq. So what it went on the Silk Road were the very exotic luxuries, the very expensive things that normally end up being marked up by about 1,000% or more. And Europe, on its side, was also sending goods. The famous Roman glass, who will become terribly famous in Asia, to the point that now Afghanistan is, is where we find the best Roman glass. 2,000 years later, they had kept the tradition of made a very precious glass that was awfully expensive at the times. And yet, being fragile, as you imagine, they were, the price was more expensive because many pieces will get broken. Skins, normally from the area around the Black Sea, all the precious furs, and something that in Asia didn't know, which was oil and wine, and grapes. Grapes were something completely exotic, and the Chinese were completely flabbergasted that wine could be made for something else that was not rice or other fruits. But as you can see, the products that were coming from Asia were terribly sophisticated. They were showing a tremendous amount of skill. When the things that were going from the Mediterranean were more materials, things who were not very, they didn't take much skill except for the wine. We were talking about two very different civilizations at the time. Here you can see mostly where the cities that they were crossing, that the Silk Road was crossing. And we are talking, we're talking about more than 7,000 kilometers, 20 big cities, never mind all the other oases and the small towns, and countless caravanserais and bazaars. Later I'm going to show you about these wonderful cities. And this was taken us through the most amazing and forbidden routes in the world. Enormous sand deserts, enormous rock deserts like in the bottom there, that is the Taklamakan. The Taklamakan means hell. And then of course they had to cross the Himalayas and the Pamirs. And all that has to be done on the backs of camels, who was the only animal who could actually move in that different kind of weather and terrain. Of course, the trips will take years, even if you were just doing a part of it. So when the people was moving through this forbidden terrain, sometimes will take them 2 months, 3 months to get from one point to the next. It was terribly important that they had the caravanserai. I want to try to move this. Yeah. Okay. Right. I want you to see this because it's so important. The caravanserai was the place where the travelers would arrive many times to heal the rigors of travel. It was a place they would find fresh food, the place where they could rest, the place where they could meet other travelers. But what it was so important of the caravanserai, it was not just that the travelers themselves could relax, it's that they could bring the animals and the cargo inside. As you can see there in the center, in that photograph, there is a sketch of what the caravanserai is. As the alcoves on the edges, that's where the people will rest. But the most important thing was that they could bring the animals and their cargo inside, because that was extremely valuable. That was their wealth. So the caravanserais were practically fortresses. They had security, they were very big, they were very strong. So much so that many caravanserais still existing in Asia, obviously not as caravanserais anymore, but they were built so strongly, they are still very much around. And I recommend you very much, if you travel through Central Asia, that you visit some of them. Especially in Cappadocia, that is where it's Turkey today. Many of them have made into the most beautiful hotels. And obviously they've been renovated. This one is in Iran. A bit more difficult for us to go there. As you can see, there are coves being closed down and made into bedrooms. But the rest of the buildings are exactly the walls as they were built at the time. This one is in Azerbaijan. That is where we were supposed to be now traveling. Unfortunately, we couldn't make it. But the trip is going to happen, and you are going to have another part presentation. But as I say, a lot of these caravanserais are still existing. They were so well made. So once the travelers got to caravanserai, that was a place where they were going to employ a local guide. The local guide was terribly important because this was the guide, the one person who knew the viable routes. Normally the guys will stay at the caravanserai and they will employ themselves for going, let's say, to the next caravanserai or the next 2 caravanserais. But those were the people who know what routes were viable at the time. They knew which were the source of water that could be used. And of course, were the ones who were able to forecast the weather. We must understand that was terribly important in those times because many caravans will be lost in a dust storm. I was a few years ago in a small town on the border of the Gobi, and I was walking around, and suddenly everybody disappeared. They all were running around and getting inside their homes and say, obviously something has happened. I should be making tracks to my hotel until I'm passing by a wall and some hands pull me inside the shop and they brought down a metal door. And I said, well, Liliana, here you are. You've been kidnapped and that's the end of it because nobody's going to give 2 cents for you. Anyway, soon after that, the most incredible noise started. It was actually a dust storm. It lasted for about an hour. And when my kind host, who actually had saved my life, I didn't understand it, opened that door outside, it was like the most incredible snowstorm had covered absolutely everything, but it was covered in the yellow dust of the Gobi. If I would have been outside, I would have died, of course. And that is what happened to many caravans. So once you found the local guide and you're going to find out the way to get to the next place, and most important, where to find water, as you can see. What it was an oasis at a certain time, 2 years later could be reduced to what you have there in the bottom. And a small oasis could have just completely disappeared under the dust, as you can see in the photograph on the bottom left. So once now you sort out your place, you sort out your guide, you know where you're going to find water, then we go to the next, security. Security was terribly important because, as you can imagine, these caravans were terribly carrying very, very expensive goods. There was also money carried by the merchants, and there were bands who just worked at that. They specialized in attacking caravans. They made a living out of that. Obviously, there were a lot of very expensive goods traveling there. Obviously, there was money. Therefore, as usual, there were crime. And security, there were groups who employed themselves, there were full families who dedicated themselves to provide security for the caravans. They had, of course, as you can see, a photograph of the 1800s, end of the 1800s. They still were people providing security on part of the Silk Road. You can see there that warrior armed to the teeth with armor and arrows and everything. And they were obviously tremendously important, and you couldn't really carry a caravan, have a caravan without having security. So by now you have found, you have your caravanserai, you find your guide, you have security, and then you move to the market. The markets were amazing places. I mean, you can see those photographs, it takes your senses completely, because the market was where absolutely everything happened. From, you could buy vegetables, you could buy rubies, you could buy pearls, you could buy skins. Absolutely everything happened in the bazaar. And even now, you know, the bazaar, these are bazaars of the Middle East. It's a place where absolutely everything is for sale. But let's go back to the bazaars of the times of the Silk Road. As you can see there, I was talking about buying and selling, very much so, but it also was a lot of bartering. We must understand that at those times, bartering was the way where most business was done. And obviously there were certain rules, people, the merchant themselves, so many rules, rubies were worth so much saffron, etc., etc. But bartering and exchange. So many of the goods will be sold at that bazaar. Wouldn't make it all the way to China, all the way to Rome. And other goods will be bought there to go forward. Of course, some very precious things, some things like if a merchant knew that this was extremely expensive in China, they will try to keep it and carry it through. But that means that the overheads, there will be many more guides, many more caravanserais, many more security. So every time the goods that were carried, they were becoming more expensive. And that brings us to the matter of money. What did they do for money if they were not, if they were not bartering? Well, there was not, the two major currencies of the Silk Road. Hello, somebody, okay. The two most important currencies that were used on the Silk Road at the time was the silver drachm. is what we call the drachma, very much a currency in the Middle East. The drachma of Sasanian Iran, and the gold solidus of the East Roman or the Byzantine Empire. You must understand that at the time, the coins, it was not like now that a piece of nickel is worth, let's say, £1 or 5 rand or whatever. A coin at the time that was representing, let's say, £1 of silver, it was to be made of £1 of silver, right? So there was not a lot of gold and silver at the time. Much of that have not been discovered. Remember that gold and silver were discovered for the first time in great amount much later when they made it to the Americas. And of course, later even when it was South Africa. So there was not a lot of gold and silver. So there was not a lot of coin around. And the coins were very valuable. And as you can see on the top left corner, those holes in the coins was because the coins were stitched, sewn onto the clothing. And in the case of the ones in the right-hand corner, the hole is because then the coin put into around your neck, under your clothing, obviously. So coin was terribly valuable, and the only big, how we say, other values, metal that it was in the market at the time was the solidus from Rome. Those were very rare, and as you realize, you had to buy a lot of merchandise for something like that. So much later, paper money was invented by the Chinese. Of course, that made it much easier because you were free in all this metal. This metal could be used for jewelry, could be used for so many other things. But the problem is, paper money from China, shall we say, was only valued in China because the paper money of China had a backing of metal in China, but it didn't have that backing of metal, let's say, in Samarkand. So while paper money was a great invention that today we use, at the time when there was not an international value for it, it was really not that practical. So we were talking about goods, we were talking about an exchange, and we're talking about buying and selling. But something else happened. Was a great technical and cultural exchange also happening, because people saw things, brought ideas, brought concepts, what even philosophical concepts. But it's something we must understand, that between the Han Empire on one side and the Roman Empire on the other side, the great technical and cultural exchange was mostly one side, because the Han Empire was much more sophisticated. It was a much older empire, had arrived at many techniques that the West, that the Mediterranean didn't have. Much later, as we know, the technical exchange has been going the other way. But during the early days of the Silk Road, it was mostly from the East to the West. The Chinese four great inventions, as well as the skills of silkworm breeding and silk spinning, later the West were going to steal those skills too, were transmitted to the West were paper making and printing, gunpowder, and the compass. Those four grand inventions of ancient China were going to revolutionize all of the world known at the time. As we can see, none of those four things, paper making, paper printing, pulverizing, and of course the compass, were known at the time in the West. Let's start with the first compasses. The first compasses were made of lodestone, which is a naturally magnetized stone with iron, who was used for navigation during the Chinese Han Dynasty, 20 BC to 20 AD. So this was, you can't understand how important that was at the time. We didn't, of course, there were not even maps. So it was terribly, terribly important because it will give us a sense of direction. Before they've been using the stars and the sun, but if you were in a storm, if it was dark, if it was cloudy, people didn't have an idea where to go. So the trip has to stop until you could again see the stars and the sun. And remember that the stars are not exactly the same from one hemisphere to the other. So even if somebody knew certain stars, they didn't know the other stars were on the other side. So the compass was tremendously important and was going to change the way the people could travel all over the world. The Chinese made the most beautiful. In fact, normally I like to show you things when we have a presentation. I got some beautiful, beautiful compass from that part of the world. And you cannot imagine the amount of detail that they went into. The other thing was paper making, of course. Until then, the Egyptians were flattening papyrus to write on papyrus, but it was very brittle. They were also writing on skins of animals, which were stretched and scraped, but also took a long time to prepare and was very expensive. And for the everyday, the Romans were using the clay tablets to make, when slightly weight clay tablets. They will be marked on there, and they will put aside. But they were brittle, and they were disappearing, and they were broken. The invention of paper making with the pulp, originally of cotton, and flax, what we call linen now, and later tree pulp, was completely a revolution. You could make surface in which it could be that could be written on, that would be cut to exact shape, that could be piled on top of each other, and they will much stronger. So paper making came to the West, and soon after that, of course, came printing. There were two ways of printing at the time. As we know, in Europe, printing was not well known, and the writing of books, it was done by hand. Normally it was in the monastery, because were the few people who knew how to write, and the monks spent enormous time copying by hand every book. That means that books were incredibly expensive, and very few people had access to them. It was the church or the few members of the aristocracy who could afford those books. But now suddenly, we found out that carving a piece of wood, that will be the size of a page, and carving there all the writing, as you can see in the top, you could print, you could take a stamp of that as many times as you wanted, which means once you carve a page, you could print it 100 times, 200 times, and that brought the price of a book much cheaper. But then they went one more beyond that. Instead of having to be carving every page one by one, they discovered what it was rotary, what it was mobile printing, as you can see in the bottom, which means you could make a small seal of every ideogram or letter, arrange it in a tray, and have that page, which again could be printed as many times as you wanted, but then you didn't have to go and carve another page. You could rearrange all the signs again, and carve another, and print another page. That brought us to these books. And that, as we know, in the 1400s, eventually Gutenberg printed the first Bible. But suddenly there were books around. You could print many of them. The printing of books became much cheaper, because the books became much cheaper. Not only the church or the aristocracy had access to books, but many more people could buy books. Many more people had access to ideas. Many more people could have their own Bible and their interpretation. And that brought a tremendous political and religious change in Europe. As we know, the Reformation and much more. Without printing, we never would have got to books that were very accessible to everyone. So, the other one invention that it was very important at the time, it was gunpowder. very interesting because gunpowder in itself in China was only used for fireworks. It was, again, a luxury and for occasions of celebration. Only much later, they started to use gunpowder for launching arrows, but it was never really used much as a way of anything else but fireworks. But that was taken to Europe, and in Europe, immediately gunpowder was converted, it was used, they created the cannon, they created firearms. And those firearms were going to change completely the nature of war in Europe. The great cannon makers of the time were the Genoese, and they were well known and renowned in Europe for their skill. But the interesting thing is that the gunpowder that came from China to Europe later was going to be turned against China. You probably know about the famous gunboat policy, when the countries of the West they were imposing trade of the countries of the East, even if the countries of the East didn't want it. And when the countries of the East didn't want it, especially as we know what happened in China and Vietnam, but especially to China, the European powers came with their gunboats and established themselves in the coast of these countries, either they like it or not. I'm not going to pass any comment on the politics of it, but I'm just explaining how gunpowder eventually came back to the East. Right, but now let's talk about something beyond good and beyond discoveries. And we are talking about religions. Because together with economic and technological exchange between the East and the West, the religion of the West were introduced into the East. Those were Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, Christianity, Mahayanianism, Nestorianism, and Islam. Right. Zoroastrianism, but I'm glad with my accent, that's a difficult one to say, was actually a religion very similar to the old Hebrew religion. They believe in one God. It's just that the God was the sun, and but very much the rules at Tainara were the same. Nestorianism was a form of Christianity. It was what we will call the Christian Church of the East, very much separated from the Christian Church of Rome. And the important religions that were going to have relevance in Asia were going to be Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam. Now Rupert, sorry, Rupert is here, and he's very interested in one of the cables. Right, let's start with the one that came first. The one that came first was Buddhism, right? And the first record that we had was Faxian, who was a Chinese Buddhist monk who traveled into India to learn more about the religion. He took to the southern Silk Road. He traversed the Himalayas to get to Gandhara, Peshawar, and finally India. Faxian walked most of his time on his way to India. Well, he lived only 29 years. Of course, at the time, people didn't live that long. But if you walk all that, it's not very surprising. Anyway, the other the other traveler who went to get the writings, the Buddhist writings from India. Remember that. Well, today we say that India was in Nepal, and those days the Buddha, that part where the Buddha was born was India, and he was enlightened in India, and very close to Varanasi and the city of Gandhara. So Swanshan was a Chinese Buddhist monk and a translator who traveled from China to India on the northern Silk Road and then back home again on the southern Silk Road. So this guy did the whole circuit, and he started in the year 629 and didn't return to China until 645. So he was traveling for 16 years around that part of the world. We in the West don't know very much about it, but in the East he's very famous. His travels and grew into legends, which inspired novels and plays and later in history. He was a little bit like the Marco Polo of the West. He was not just a monk, he was interested in so many other things that were happening in the world he was discovering. So Buddhism became terribly important in the East. Here I'm showing you some beautiful photograph of the Mogao Caves, which is what we call the cave of the Thousand Buddhas. Those are in the edge of the Taklamakan and the Gobi. From the outside, as you can see on the top corner, they just look like poor caves carved on the side of the mountain. But they are very, very, very beautiful. I recommend tremendously that you do the trip to it. I just put a few photographs. There are a few very, very big Buddhas on the face of the mountains, but it is the frescoes inside that will really take your breath away. It did it for me. And the Mogao Caves, it was a time that, like, you know, with all the revolutions and invasions and etc. that happened, they were kind of forgotten to the civilization of that world, and they were kind of rediscovered in the 1800s by Stein. Yeah. And he was one of those travelers, discoverers that came from Europe in the 17 and 1800s. And the sad thing is, when he discovered those beautiful frescoes, he actually cut the rock to take many of those frescoes back to Europe. And they really were stolen from the caves of Thousand Buddhas. He wanted humanity to see them. The irony is that those frescoes were displayed in the Berlin Museum. And in the Second World War, when Berlin was bombed, those frescoes were bombed to smithereens, and they don't exist anymore. Anyway, still, there are some amazing frescoes and most beautiful statues in the Mogao Caves. But I show you here another photograph, and that just gives you an idea of the size of some of those statues, the giants of the Mogao Caves. But those was not the only giants of the Buddhist architecture. They are the Bamiyan Buddhas. I think all of us know about the Bamiyan Buddhas and what happened about 15 years ago. Well, let's start from the beginning. We tend to think that Afghanistan has always been an Islamic country. Well, that is not true. Afghanistan was also a Buddhist country. In fact, there is amazing and most beautiful art, Buddhist art, originated in Afghanistan. Anyway, in this country, there were these amazing carvings of the Bamiyan Buddhas. But when Afghanistan was under the rule of Taliban, the Taliban decided that those Buddhas had to go. Countries from all over the world asked them to please accept that they were belong part of the treasure of the whole world. They were obviously UNESCO heritage. Some countries even offer to buy them, to pay for them, but the Taliban said no. And this is what happened. It was very, very sad. And all the Buddhas were dynamited. As you can see in the photograph on the right, that is what it is today. Obviously, that photograph is not mine. I had the fortune to go to Afghanistan in the 90s when it was not easy, but we could still travel to Afghanistan. But now it is not possible. That is a Getty image that you see there. But all the art, all the Buddhist art in Afghanistan, unfortunately, it doesn't exist anymore. But, and this is one of my photographs, there are still Buddhist monasteries in many parts, in many, many parts of Asia, in some of the most impossible places, as you can see there, and very much alive, and very much doing the studies of sutras. They are more than 1,000 years old, and they have them in there. That is in the age of the Gobi, going beyond Da Nang, and that is north of Xi'an. And if any of you decide to visit that part of the world, please do contact me, and I will explain you how to get there. It's definitely worth it. Right. The other religion that was going to be very important, not for the religion itself, but for the people it brought into Asia, it was Christianity. There were two types of Christianity, as you know. The church in Europe that was divided at the beginning of the year 300, and what it was the Roman Church, which we call the Papal Christianity, and the Church of the East, which is the one today practiced by the Greeks and the Russian, the Orthodox Church. But at the time, it was what it was, the Syrian and the Armenian Church. And those, in fact, Armenia was the first country to declare itself officially Christian. That was what is called Nestorianism. And those were the first missionaries who went into Asia, and they made quite they had a very successful mission. But while there are still some Nestorian churches in Asia, it wasn't terribly successful beyond the 10th century. While on the other hand, the church from Rome, who sent also missionaries to proselytize, sent missionaries who were very, very well educated, especially the Jesuits. So while they didn't do so well in the proselytizing business, they were extremely good about map making, history making, writing memories of what they were finding. These were scholars, and as scholars, they created incredible maps that were probably the first maps existing of the different places of the Silk Road. But they were not only making maps, as they were scholars, they were also writing accounts of the places they were visiting. It's equivalent if you are between so and so and you're arriving close to Bukhara, well, you're going to find that there are certain walls and this and that, which was extremely important for travelers. And on top of that, they did one of the most important jobs needed. They started converting all the different alphabets and all the different writings of the language of the Silk Road. They were phonetically converted to the Roman alphabet. Working with the local academics, shall we call it, they started converting sounds to be, so we could write them in the Latin alphabet, what we today call the Roman alphabet, and we could pronounce it. That was tremendously important. I know that, of course, certain things were not perfectly right. We know that it was not Peking, but it should be Beijing. But it was a universal work that permitted to put names to those maps that people could read and pronounce it in a way that somebody else in another country, in another language, could understand it. And so, the next religion that came into Asia, it was Islam. Please understand that I'm putting that in the way they were appearing. Islam came about 450 years after Jesus Christ. It was a very important religion that came from the Middle East. The Prophet Muhammad was his leader, who gave the indications of what he was supposed to do by his followers in the world. And one of them was they were supposed to bring the religion to other parts of the world, to convert the kafirs, which were the non-believers, and to take it as far as possible. So they came from Asia Minor, and they moved into what today we call Turkey, but Turkey was not Turkey at the time. There were not Turks in Turkey. And they moved into Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan. And from Afghanistan, they moved over the Khyber Pass into India, and they conquered a big part of India. But with, as usual, with the conquest, always came the culture. And there are things that the Silk Road have much to thank to the Islamic conquest, and those are the sciences. When Islam expanded beyond the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century, its growth coincided with the golden age of scholarship across the sciences. Remember that at the time, Europe had really gone down completely. They're going into what we call the Dark Ages. During this time, Muslim scholars made major advances in the medical sciences, building on the knowledge of Greece, ancient Mesopotamia, and Iran, while at the same time incorporating medical knowledge from other regions which reached the Islamic world by the Silk Roads. China was extremely good on medicines, on different herbs for cures, and those were incorporating in the medicine of the times. And of course, what was very important was that they were allowed to work on the bodies of the people, which in Europe the church had prohibited. So while Europe was going to the Dark Ages and people were not be able to work with the bodies themselves, the Arabs, the Islamic doctors were able to practice, to experiment, and because from Greece to China, they were incorporating and synthesizing this. And in fact, any king who was worth his salt was trying to have an Islamic doctor. But besides medicine, we owe something very important to Islam, and that was they synthesize the different numeric systems along the Silk Road into only one. You know, there were the decimals, there were the ones for base of 12, there were different signs, there were set. So all that was synthesized in one system, and the numbers that we still use today. As we were talking, the Silk Road base was business. So numbers were tremendously important. You might not be able to talk to the person you are doing business with, but you can write that number in the sand. In fact, we still do that many times nowadays where we are negotiating in the market when we don't understand each other. So, medicine and numbers. In the meantime, the caravans kept on going. The world kept on changing. There were massive ecological changes, which means people were moving. Nothing was static. It was not only trade that was moving along the Silk Road. People were always moving. There were massive migrations coming from Asia into the area of the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. We know that the Arabs have moved from Asia from Central Asia into Asia Minor and established themselves there. But the Turkomans was probably one of the bigger migration coming from Central Asia into the Mediterranean. The They still are Turkomans in Central Asia. It's what we know today as Chinese Turkestan. How you call it? We call it Xinjiang. Sorry, I know you are there, and I know I'm mispronouncing it very badly, but Xinjiang, Chinese Turkestan, and it's very nice. It's a beautiful part of the world, and it's very interesting because you are there in the middle of in what is China now, and the people eat kebabs, and they have pitas, and it's exactly the same that if you were, obviously, that if you go to Turkey. So anyway, these people from Chinese Turkestan will start moving slowly and eventually establish themselves in what we call Turkey today. That's what I was saying earlier on, and at the beginning, on the early centuries, that was part of the Greek Empire and later the Roman Empire. There were no Turks in Turkey, but the migrations will start. And so, something more important comes into the Silk Road, the Mongols, Genghis Khan. This was going to change the world completely, not only in Asia, but in Europe. There were small tribes, but together they conquered the world. Let me move this. Genghis Khan was the founder and the emperor of the Mongol Empire, which became the largest continuous empire in history. After his death, he came to power by uniting many of the nomadic tribes of Northern Asia. The interesting thing of the Mongols is, yes, he got all the tribes together one by one. He conquered them. The ones who wanted to come with him, many did, of course, or otherwise they were put to the knife. He didn't have a problem of that. They were completely nomads. During the time of Genghis, the Mongols were nomads. They kept on moving all the time from east to west, and as we know it, they made it all the way through Europe up to the Alps and nearly to Rome. The Pope asked him and paid a very big tribute, so he wouldn't come into Rome. And they also say that the people themselves wanted to go back to Asia, so he didn't go beyond that. But imagine his empire, he had conquered from China all the way to what we know as Italy today. They could travel extremely fast. They could sleep on those horses. They could fight on those horses. They were unstoppable. And when he was surrounded a city, they offered them to, when they surrounded the city, they offered them to surrender. And if they didn't, everybody, once they was conquered, everybody was put to a sword. They were merciless. But at the same time, they were very efficient and very well organized. So, in the year 1200, the Mongol Empire, through Genghis Khan, adopted a postal station. And I'm going to tell you how important that was. It was empire-wide, an empire-wide message system carried out by their messages. Now, as you can see on the bottom there, you see how the empire was subdivided in very small sections. All those sections had a postal station. And those postal stations, there were a lot of fresh horses, animals, sheep, for food, of course. They had mules, they had everything. So the messengers will arrive to postal stations. They had little bells so the people knew that the messenger was arriving. Fresh horses were prepared. Food was put on those horses, and the messenger will move into the next part of the road. It was incredibly fast. And because Genghis and his Mongols were merciless, there was something that didn't exist before. There was peace. Finally, we arrived at it was called the Pax Mongolica. Information and security were available for the first time because everything was under one law. And the law was brutal. You did something wrong, you were killed. That was it. You didn't go to prison. So everybody obeyed those rules or else. And actually, it was a time of tremendous prosperity for the Silk Road. It was so much easier to travel. There were less bandits. You pay a certain tribute, but everything was provided for you. It was so safe that it was said that a maid with a purse of gold could travel from one end to the other of the Silk Road, and her virtue and her gold will be intact. So, when Genghis died, the Mongol Empire was divided between his sons and his grandsons. While the Golden Horde and the Khanate and all that kept on fighting against their neighbors, and they kept on having wars, what we call today the Chinese part of the Mongol Empire, it became the Yuan dynasty of China, with its capital in Karakorum, but later a new capital was built. That is the one that we're going to be talking today. But anyway, the son of Genghis Khan, who inherited the Chinese part of it, he lived for very short years and he was not very good. But it was his grandson, Kublai Khan, the one who we are going to hear all about it, the one who really created an immense and amazing world, and the one who was going to be trading with Europe. At the same time, we must remember that from this period, when so much had been destroyed, so much was rebuilt. And the cities that we find today along the Silk Road, here we got Bukhara and Samarkand, belong to that period. And that is because the Mongols, when they were conquered cities, they didn't put everybody to a sword. They were separating architects here, painters there, builders there, jewelers there, and then made sure that all the cities that they were controlling have a certain number of every different skill that was needed. So that made possible what I would call a renaissance of these places. And many of them, if you go to those cities today, were rebuilt after the Mongol conquest with the Mongol support. Samarkand here, but later we will talk about what the cities of the Silk Road look like today. So, by now, we got the Pax Mongolica, people can travel, and Europe started sending merchant princes to the other side to try to arrange a special deal so they could have the mandate of the goods. And it was like suddenly the people from Europe wanted to bypass the merchants of Asia Minor and go direct to the other side. And that brings us to something, and to someone very important, the Polos. The Polos were one of those merchant houses. We must understand that at the time the road finished in what Constantinople is what we call Istanbul today, what it was Byzantium before. On one side of the straits, the Mediterranean connects with the Black Sea. On one side were all the palaces where the Sultan was. If anybody goes today to Istanbul, it's what we call Sultan Ahmed. And on the other side of the water were the merchant houses, right? And the caravans will arrive there. The merchant houses will have their warehouses, and they receive the goods, and then they will, by boat, take them to the different parts of Europe. The biggest merchant houses were the ones of the city of Genoa and the city of Venice. Now Venice comes into the picture. And remember, Italy didn't exist at the time. They were independent cities, and they had their own rulers, and they had their own financial system. So Venice itself was very, very important. And two merchants from the city of Venice were the Polos. The Polos had set themselves to travel on the Silk Road, but they were more ambitious. They wanted to go all the way to China, and they made it. They really went there. They met Kublai Khan, the great ruler of the East, and after spending years in telling them all about the things that happened on the West, Kublai Khan told them that he wanted Rome to send her priests to explain the religion to him, and he wanted oil from the sacred sepulchre of Jesus in Jerusalem. So the Polos come back to Venice, but he found that his wife had died, and he had a son that he didn't know. That was Marco Polo. So the story was what to do with this young teenager. So he thought about putting it as an apprentice. That's what it was done at the time with a young person. But Marco didn't have any of that. Marco wanted to go with his father and his uncle from Asia to Asia. And he made it. He made it all the way. We're going to go into that. He made it all the way, and then he came back. By that time, Venice and Genoa were at war. Of course, Marco was a Venetian. He fought on the side of the Venetians, and his boat was taken. And Marco Polo ended up in jail. And at the end of the story, it starts the story. In Genoa, in the year 1298, the author Rustichello da Pisa shared his cell with a Venetian captain who spoke of 1,001 fabulous lands. As a writer, Rustichello could not remain indifferent to the snippets of fabulous stories told by his new friends. So he managed to convince him to tell him his life story. And that is how Marco Polo, back from 25 years of traveling, began recounting his adventures. From his Genoa prison, the Venetian explorer remembered his travels: Venice, Acre, Jerusalem, Armenia, the Himalayas, all the way to the palace of the great Kublai Khan. And so, the adventures of Marco Polo were written. Here we have a painting of Marco Polo. He was already quite mature. Marco Polo lived to about 70, which was quite a full age for a people of his times. And the first adventure book, probably, it was written. It took the imagination of everyone, and I think it still takes the imagination of everyone now. It definitely took my imagination when I was a young child, and probably that's why I got this thirst for traveling. I think it was owing to Marco Polo. But let's go into that. The travels of Marco Polo, that is being translated in practically every language, made it at the time when printing was becoming used in Europe, which means also that many more people could share on that. And that brought not just the royalty and the church into the Silk Road. So here we got a 17-year-old Marco living his Venice. I love that illustration of Venice at the time. Venice already had become a much more sophisticated city. We must understand that Venice was very, very rich. these independent city kingdoms of what later was going to become Italy, they all had different characteristics. But Venice being on the Adriatic side of what we call today Italy, it was very, very much in contact with the East, which means it was much more sophisticated. So anyway, Marco leaves his native city. He was only supposed to go to Jerusalem. That was what his father had agreed on, you know, and then he was supposed to come back and go to the warehouses at the edge of the Black Sea. But of course, he was a teenager. He obviously drove his father crazy enough, and Marco actually made the trip all the way. He probably, they crossed the Mediterranean and a boat very similar to that. And from the Mediterranean, they came into the Bosphorus to go into the Black Sea to start the journey that will take them all the way across Asia. There is a map of what were going to be the whole travels of Marco Polo. Of course, the bottom area, there will be the trips that he did afterwards, some of them for Kublai, and some of them on his way back. But nevertheless, as you can see there from the top, from Venice into Constantinople, they were to Acre because they were to pick up some monks. At that time, Acre was in the hands of the Crusaders, and they were bringing them oil from the sacred sepulchre. They were to take to Kublai Khan. And some monks also were coming along. In fact, the monks were not going to make it very far. A couple of them died, and the other two decided to go back to Jerusalem. But as you can see, it was a long, long road, and the first trip used to take more than 3 years. The Marco Polo was away from 1271 to 1295. So he was traveling for 24 years. He crossed the Gobi, and very interesting is this town, fortress in the Gobi that's mentioned, and the trips of Marco Polo is still existing. And as you can see, the Bactrian camels is still very much a way of transport in that part of the world. So eventually, Marco Polo would make it to Xanadu. Xanadu, of course, was a place of legend and fable. We call it that. I love that representation. There are many different representations that the Europeans were doing of Xanadu. They didn't have an idea what Xanadu looked like. So they always Xanadu had meant in the way for us, always meant a place of myth and legend. The truth is, Xanadu was what we knew as Jendu, and it's very much there is an archaeological site, and it's next to what is at Xi'an. I'm sure that many of you have heard of Xi'an. That is where the terracotta warriors come from, and for many years it was the capital of China, and a tremendous, well, it was the end of the east end of the Silk Road. What you see that photograph on the right-hand side, it's carved in the mountain. There are the most amazing carves of Kublai Khan and his people. So, Marco Polo had made it to Xanadu, the place of fantasy and mystery. Imagine for a young guy who never traveled everywhere to make it to a place like that. This is what we have of Xanadu today. Probably is more important what is being written and what is being painted. But nevertheless, Xanadu is still very much alive, and a lot of poetry. And so what is I can't remember the name now. There was a very famous English poet that he wrote a lot about Xanadu, and he always said that Coleridge that he had to smoke opium, and then he will see Xanadu in his mind. Nevertheless, as I said, the city of Kublai, Xanadu. Oh, let's get rid of me here. Is Xi'an today. That is the famous drum tower that is being restored many times. It's very old, and probably goes definitely back to the times of the Silk Road. There is a photograph of Kublai Khan. But the important thing is that Marco Polo was introduced to Kublai, and a rapport was established between this young guy and the ruler of a big part of the world. So much so that his energy was somehow used by Kublai, who declared him as an ambassador and sent him to many places of his empire and other ones that I didn't know. So that's why Marco Polo ended up going to places like Vietnam, Laos, Sri Lanka, a lot of places that at the time in the West we didn't know they existed. Of course, he went as the ambassador of the ruler. I love this. You can see these illustrations. They come from the first books, or the first Marco Polo books. They appear in Europe, and those are the representations that Europeans did of the travels of Marco Polo in Asia. Of course, I'm sure they're quite incorrect, you know, but I love this. Marco Polo, what looks like a leper sitting behind on his horse, or Marco Polo on the other side there arriving with an elephant, a camel, and some kind of animals visiting these places of the East. But the truth is, Marco Polo did travel a lot in the name of Kublai Khan, and eventually Kublai allowed him to come back to the West. And as I told you, after 25, 26 years, he made it back to the Black Sea, and things didn't go so well for him after that. But his stories are amazing, and they're very much alive today in our civilization. But there was another traveler that many of us don't know so much. That was Ibn Battuta. Now, Ibn Battuta was a Muslim Berber. He did, we're talking about 100 years later. You know, Marco Polo was in the 1200s, Ibn Battuta was in the 1300s. He was a Muslim Berber Moroccan scholar. He was an explorer. He widely traveled the medieval world. Over a period of 30 years, Ibn Battuta visited most of the Islamic world and many other lands, including Central Asia, Southeast Asia, India, and China. The sad thing is that Ibn Battuta only lived for 29 years. You can see in the map on the side that all the travels that he did. But he was a completely different kind of traveler. And he was very, very much something completely new in the story of the Silk Road. In Egypt, where he arrived by the land route by Tunis and Tripoli, an irresistible passion for travel was born in his soul, and he decided to visit as many parts of the world as possible, setting as a rule never to travel any road a second time. This was a traveler for travel itself. He had a passion for seeing new places, and he traveled so much in that short life that he had. His contemporaries traveled for practical reasons, for trade, for pilgrimage, for education. But even Batuta did it for its own sake, for the joy of learning about new countries and new people. That was completely new at the time. And because of that, and because of the experiences and the adventures that he had around, he made a living out of it, benefiting from his scholarly status and later from his increasing fame as a traveler. He enjoyed the generosity of numerous rulers in the countries he visited in the Silk Road and wrote about them. This was the original backpacker. He traveled because he wanted to see, he wanted to know. And then he wrote about it. Shall we say the lonely planet of the times? He wrote about it and gave indications for others. He was a trailblazer. He traveled to many, many places in his short life. So we had two great travelers of this, whose names are forever embedded in the Silk Road, Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta. But something else traveled on the Silk Road. And in the middle of the 1300s, the pest was to come from the east to the west. What happened is, as you know, the bubonic plague resides in fleas, and those fleas normally live on the rodents, rats, marmots, whatever. Looks like there were big ecological changes happening in Asia, that the rodent population died. Therefore, the fleas had to find a place. They had to inhabit animals and humans, especially the camels, because they don't affect, they don't kill a camel, they don't kill a camel at all. So the fleas carrying the bubonic pest start traveling from the east to the west, and it was going to be a pandemic. The plague in the 1300s eventually became a disaster in the east as well as in the west. It killed off many of the Mongol rulers and other elites and weakened the army as well as the local economies. The Black Death killed 25 million people in Asia and North Africa between 1347 and 1350, in addition to the carnage in Europe of another 26 million. So we're talking pandemic. That happens when civilizations start communicating with each other. It's not only, unfortunately, only culture and technology. The Black Death were going to be a problem for many, many years in Europe. I was going to be coming and going until the 1700s. And there was no medicine or anything that could control it. I think in these times that we are living now with coronavirus, it shows us that even in those times, and with much less population than we can have now, how the scourge these pandemics can be. Well, besides the pandemic of the bubonic plagues in the 1300s, something else was going to happen. The fall of Constantinople. Mehmed II conquers Constantinople, who was in the hands, and the very weak hands by then, of Constantine XI. And so the foothold that Christianity had, and what, yes, will become the Ottoman Empire, it was gone. There was no more Christians in that part of the world. And they all were kicked out of Constantinople. Constantinople later was going to become Istanbul, and it will be in the hands of the descendants of Mehmed for many, many years. They were the Ottomans, and that's part of another talk. But the fall of Constantinople, Sultan Mehmed II of the Ottoman Empire wasn't made 1453, when the Byzantine Empire came to an end, when the Ottomans breached Constantinople ancient land wall after besieging the city for 15 days. And that meant the fall of Constantinople led to Hagia Sophia, the church that were converted into a mosque. That meant that non-believers were not allowed to be in Constantinople. That meant all the European traders had to leave. And so we came to the end of the road. Very sad, isn't it? The rulers of the new Constantinople and all that land closed the gate to the Silk Road. The Silk Road itself, not having the outlet of Constantinople, with so many things could be sold to the Mediterranean world, and so many things brought from the Mediterranean world to the east, became much poorer. And in 1453, it was the end of the Silk Road. But I hope that you will join us in the second part of this lecture, because there were new Silk Roads. The Silk Road itself didn't die, it changed for the present and for the future of the world that it is today. The Silk Road had brought changes in the world, and new roads were discovered. As usual, trade was needed, new roads will be found. That is something we are going to talk and discuss in part 2, because Europe had been going through the Renaissance, where a lot of new inventions and new investigations and new research was happening. Renaissance means rebirth. The beginning of the Renaissance is dated from that year, 1453, when the fall of Constantinople drove many scholars with knowledge of Greek and Roman learning, which will go westwards until 1750. So, and the need for knowledge, the need to reestablish trade will bring new discoveries and new sea routes. So, I would like you to join me in part 2, because I want to show you some of the amazing places that still exist on the Silk Road. For this, since I have my own photographs most of the time, so I don't have to use ancient illustrations. I want you to see some of the places of the Silk Road. Those colored mountains are real. They do exist. I'll show you more about that. I want to show you, I want to share this with you, of the places of the Silk Road and cities like that. They are very much alive. Places where the people still live in the steppes, and people, the people themselves of the Silk Road. So the Silk Road is very much alive. The things have changed, the politics have changed, and the Silk Road can be traveled. And some places you can do very independent, you can do independent traveling, and other places you will have to join group caravans. I would like to tell you about it too. So I hope that you will join us for part 2 to visit the cities of the Silk Road today, to talk what happened after 1453, and to share the people of the Silk Road